Okay, well, hello everyone and welcome. We are very excited to be sharing our SIMAP webinar on our progress on complete scope 3 today. So SIMAP is a tool for calculating carbon and nitrogen footprints at the campus scale. And historically, we've had all of scope 1 categories, scope 2 categories, and some scope 3 categories in SIMAP. And for some time now, we've had it on our wish list to be adding the additional scope 3 categories to make progress towards complete scope 3. And thanks to the work of two great summer fellows that we've had the opportunity to work with over the past few months here, and that's Tigran, Aslanyan, and Mello, we've made progress on upstream emissions from energy for the fuel and energy related activities category in SIMAP. And so today we're going to be sharing some of their preliminary results. And a couple of just quick housekeeping items. So I wanted to mention that we are recording this webinar. We'll be posting it later on, as well as posting the slides later on. When you're not speaking, please keep yourself muted, but we will have plenty of time for Q&A later on. And as questions occur to you throughout the webinar, please enter them into the chat function. And we'll be keeping an eye on those, and we will be going through all of those questions at the end. So this is our outline for the webinar today. We're going to be starting with some background, going over what is complete scope 3, what are scopes. We'll talk about what aspects of scope 3 are already in SIMAP and what additional aspects we would need, what additional categories we would need to get complete scope 3 reporting. And we'll talk about some of the benefits to accounting for complete scope 3. Then Tigran and Emily will present on their work from this summer on their progress towards fuel and energy related activities. And specifically, they've been working on solar, fuel oil, and natural gas, looking at the upstream emissions from those categories. Then finally, Jen will wrap up talking about how to manage these changing system boundaries. So when we're adding new categories to our footprint, how do we communicate that, and how does that affect our goal setting? So we'd like to start with just some quick introductions of our team here. So this is our SIMAP team. I'm Leach. I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the UNH Sustainability Institute.
Thanks, Allie. And I'm Jen Andrews. I'm a project director at the UNH Sustainability Institute.
Thanks, Jen. I'm Ben Robinson. I'm a technical program assistant here at SIMAP.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tigran, and I'm one of the summer fellows at the UNH.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mello. I'm currently a graduate student in the physics department at UNH, and I am also a summer fellow with the UNH Sustainability Institute.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so all of the calculations and the methodology that we have in SIMAP is grounded in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And that's a set of standards or guidance that's put out by the World Resources Institute. It provides guidance on how to calculate greenhouse gas footprints. And they started with a general guidance document, which primarily covered scope 1 and scope 2. And they had a more recent specific document on scope 2, and then most recently released this document on scope 3, looking at the corporate value chain for scope 3 reporting. And so this guidance document covers all of the scope 3 categories and provides recommendations for calculating and reporting those emissions at the corporate scale. And so what we do for SIMAP is we take this guidance from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and adapt it to the higher ed sector to make sure that we have the most appropriate and relevant categories for the higher ed sector. So one example for that is the scope 3 category business travel, which is in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And to make that more relevant for higher ed, we've split that out into more specific categories, such as directly financed travel, study abroad, and student travel to from home. And I've been talking a lot about scopes, so we thought we should have a definition of what scopes are and go through the different scopes in a footprint. So scopes are a way of organizing emissions based on how direct they are related to a given entity or related to your campus. So scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions. These are the emissions resulting from activities generally on your campus. The examples that we have in SIMAP for campus Scope 1 emissions are on-campus stationary, so any fuels that you're burning on your campus, your fleet vehicles, so vehicles that are owned and operated by your campus, fertilizer application, fugitive emissions from refrigerants and chemicals, and emissions from any animals that you have on your campus. The other emissions for Scope 2 and Scope 3 are indirect emissions. And there's some upstream components to those. So Scope 2 indirect emissions are all upstream and are pretty specific. So Scope 2 is just looking at emissions from purchased electricity, steam, and chilled water. Scope 2 is also where we account for any market transactions for renewable energy, such as the purchase or sale of RECs. Then Scope 3, as you can see in this diagram, has a number of additional categories. So these are the upstream Scope 3 indirect emissions. Some examples are purchased goods and services, fuel and energy related activities, which we'll be talking about more today, waste, business travel, and employee commuting. There are also downstream Scope 3 categories, and we actually do not yet have any of these downstream categories for Scope 3 in SIMAP, but plan to incorporate many of these in the future. So which of these Scope 3 categories are already in SIMAP? So this is a comprehensive list of all of those Scope 3 categories in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, organized into upstream Scope 3 emissions and downstream Scope 3 emissions. So the categories that we have already fully accounted for in SIMAP are these three: waste, business travel, and employee commuting. And the terminology or categories that might be more familiar to you all, for waste, we have two more specific categories: waste and wastewater. Business travel, we have split up across directly financed travel, study abroad, and student travel to from home. Then for employee commuting, we of course need to also account for student commuting here. So commuting is split up into categories for staff commuting, faculty commuting, and student commuting. We also have several categories that we've accounted for on a partial basis so far. First, for purchased goods and services, we already account for two goods, food and paper, where you can enter in the amount that you're purchasing for those products and calculate your footprint for them. For fuel and energy related activities, we already account for transmission and distribution losses for electricity. So this is the emissions associated with generating and delivering delivery of the electricity that you're purchasing. So the emissions that happen before you use that electricity. Then we do have a small component for transportation and distribution, and that's embedded in the food emissions factors. For those of you who are signatories to the climate commitment or the carbon commitment that's managed by Second Nature, then there are three of these categories that they have fields right now for entering your footprint. And those are in the business travel category for directly financed travel and study abroad, commuting, of course, and there's also a field for fuel and energy related activities. And then Second Nature also provides several additional other customized fields, so that if you have other emissions you're tracking, you can also enter those. And today, of course, we're focusing in on this fuel and energy related activities category. So let's take a closer look at how emissions are distributed across these different Scope 3 categories for a campus footprint. So here I have an example graph using some data from UNH from several years ago, and the footprint is broken up across Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So in this case, this footprint is pretty evenly distributed across the three scopes. Then if we zoom in just on Scope 3, this legend here on the far right has a full list of all of the Scope 3 categories that we currently have in SIMAP. And the distribution that you see here is fairly typical of what we see across colleges and universities for their Scope 3 footprint. So in general, commuting tends to be a pretty large category for Scope 3. Directly financed travel is also generally a pretty big category. Study abroad can be large for universities that have a significant study abroad portion of their campus activities. And for campuses that are adding in food, we're finding that this can be a pretty big part of the Scope 3 footprint. On average, we find that for the carbon footprint, food contributes about 5 to 15% of your total carbon footprint. It's more significant for nitrogen. So if you include food in your nitrogen footprint, food production is actually going to make up over half of your nitrogen footprint on average. Then, as I mentioned earlier, what we've done is taken the categories in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and split them out to make them more relevant for the higher ed sector. So what we have here in the green text at the end is those more general categories from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. For example, the business travel category that we have split across several categories more relevant to higher ed. So if we were to add in all of those additional scope 3 categories and have true complete scope 3 reporting, what is the potential magnitude of the impact on your footprint? A few universities have started to look at this with independent calculations. This is a result from the University of Cambridge, where they looked at their 2011 to 2012 footprint, and they accounted for all of those complete scope 3 categories. And you can see that scope 1 and 2 actually only made up about 30% of their footprint when adding in those additional categories. Scope 3 was the remaining 70%. This is just one campus's analysis, of course, but it suggests that complete scope 3 could be a significant addition to many campus footprints. And you can see the largest category they found here was procurement, or purchased goods and services. And this is after we've completed fuel and energy related activities in SIMAP. The next category we plan to develop further is this procurement or purchased goods and services category. Specifically, we plan to first look at construction. We'll likely use a tool called EC3 for embodied carbon construction calculator to address that category. Then for fuel and energy related activities, they addressed this for this category for energy for scope 3, and they found it was a pretty significant contributor, about 7% of their total footprint. So it was actually larger than their commuter footprint and larger than their business travel footprint. So it could be a significant addition. Okay, so with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Tigran, who's going to tell us more about the progress he and Emily have made this summer on fuel and energy related activities.
Thank you, Ali. So I will be talking about, one second, sorry about that. Oops. Yeah, I will be talking about scope 3, category 3 emissions. And these are the emissions from fuel and energy related activities that are not included in scope 1 and scope 2. So what is included in category 3, scope 3 emissions? These are the emissions related to the production of fuels and energy purchased and consumed by the reporting organizations that are not included in scope 1 and scope 2. These category includes emissions from 4 activities. The first one is the upstream emissions of purchased fuels, which is the extraction, production, and transportation of fuels consumed by the reporting organization. And some examples include mining of coal or refining of gasoline. The second activity is the upstream emissions of purchased electricity, which is the extraction, production, and transportation of fuels consumed in the generation of electricity, steam, heating, and cooling. Again, some examples are refining of different types of fuels and extraction of natural gas. The third category is the transmission and distribution losses, which is the generation of electricity, steam, heating, and cooling that is lost in a T&D system. These emissions, scope 3, category 3 emissions, are currently included in SIMAP. And the fourth category is the generation of purchased electricity that is sold to end users, which is the generation of electricity, steam, heat, and cooling that is purchased by the reporting company and sold to end users. While this activity is particularly relevant for utility companies, some higher ed institutions, including UNH, generate their own energy and sell it to other institutions. And currently, our main focus is assigning appropriate emission factors for upstream fuel and energy-related processes from activities A and B that could be applied in SIMAP. And once we determine these emission factors, we would then move towards researching and making decisions on how to address the activity D and how it could be applied to higher ed institutions. So activities included in each type of emission factors. If we look at this diagram, we see combustion. Currently, we use combustion emission factors, which only take into consideration scope 1 and scope 2 emissions from power generation. And meanwhile, if we use life cycle emission factors, those will include all the 3 processes: upstream, fuel extraction, production, and transport, power generation, as well as T&D losses. These T&D losses and power generation are already in SIMAP, and this will help, including those emission factors, will help us get the emissions from those upstream activities. So how to calculate category 3 FERA emissions in scope 3? Companies, organizations may use either of the following methods to calculate upstream scope 3 emissions. The first is the average data method, which involves estimating emissions by using secondary emission factors for upstream emissions per unit of consumption, such as industry averages. And this is analogous to SIMAP's default emission factors for scope 1 and scope 2. And similarly, we're looking for average national and regional values to use for scope 3 FERA emissions. And the second method is the supplier-specific method, which involves collecting data from fuel providers on upstream emissions. And again, like in scope 1 and scope 2, organizations that use SIMAP will have the option of choosing supplier-specific method and use custom EF if they would like to. And to calculate these emissions, both activity data and upstream emission factors would be required. The good news is that activity data is already there. In your greenhouse gas inventories, you'll be using the fuel consumption data from your scope 1 and electricity, steam, heat, and cooling consumption data from scope 2. And we are working on the upstream emission factors. And currently, we have at least partially completed solar, fuel, oil, and natural gas upstream emission factors. And we're going to continue to work on figuring out for the rest of the fuels. So throughout the summer, I have been working on understanding the life cycle emissions of solar energy and have found some interesting results so far. And first, a little about the solar technologies. There are 2 primary sources of solar energy technologies: the solar photovoltaics, PV, which produces a flow of electricity directly from the sun's rays, and solar thermal energy, which is generated by using the heat from the sun to produce energy. And there are 2 main technologies of PV: the crystalline silicon, which is the most established and efficient PV technology at the moment, and thin film, which is still in its infancy stages, but has the potential to become significantly less expensive and more efficient in the near future. For solar thermal energy, they're the solar thermal collectors, which are used to convert heat into electricity, heat water, or heat spaces within buildings, and are mainly applied to small residential projects. On the other hand, the concentrating solar power plants are more popular for large utility scale solar projects. And these power plants are generally are built to be minimum of 100 megawatts, and there are only currently 11 CSP projects in the US that are operating. For SIMAP, we're collecting emission intensities for all of these types and their subtypes individually, and this means that if institutions know about about the specific type of solar technologies they use, we will be able to provide more accurate emission factors instead of using weighted averages. So like all the other fuels, solar technologies as well have their life cycle stages, from upstream to operating and downstream processes. And in the upstream process, we have everything from mining and material preparation to module manufacturing, plant component manufacturing, and finally installing and plant construction. And there are few factors that affect the life cycle of solar energy. These are the most important one is the solar irradiation, which is the amount of energy, amount of sunshine the solar technologies absorb. And these change by location. So in locations with higher solar irradiation, those emission factors would be much lower. Similarly, the average operating lifetime is 30 years for solar technologies, but as those operating lifetime increases, the emission factors will be lower. So similarly, module efficiency and performance ratio are different aspects of efficiency, and with improvements in the future, they will reduce the emission factors from all solar technologies. So it is important to note that the life cycle emission factors for solar are in emissions per unit of consumption, so, and not per panel. And that is why the difference in these factors can contribute or change the emission intensities and the final emissions. So far, some of the results that I found: the upstream emissions of solar energy technologies, as we can see on these bar charts, the upstream emissions vary by location. These emissions are much higher in locations with lower solar irradiation levels. And currently, without Scope 3, all institutions report no emissions from solar technologies. And furthermore, there are also operational and downstream processes that I just mentioned in solar energy life cycle, and would also be considered part of Scope 3 emissions, but will be counted in other categories. However, the relative impact of solar technologies is still very small compared to other fuels. We will show this comparison in a few slides. Finally, the future steps for solar Scope 3 emissions. At the moment, we are using average proportions to calculate emission factors for each life cycle stage. So adding those individual life cycle stage emission factors would be useful for the future, as well as adding emission factors for each greenhouse gas type, as currently we're using the CO2 equivalent emissions in order to account for future global warming changes in SIMAP. Finally, there are some questions that we would like you to consider, and maybe we can discuss at the end of the webinar, which relate about current adoption of solar PVs in your institutions. And these questions would help us make better and more accurate estimates in the future. And with that, Emily will continue.
Thank you. So first, I'm going to talk about the Scope 3 emissions of fuel oil. And so fuel oil is a petroleum product. It's derived from crude oil. It's mainly used in furnaces and boilers and comes in a few different types. There's distillate oil, numbers 1 through 4, and residual oil, which includes numbers 5 and 6. The most commonly used type today is number 2 distillate oil. And while residual oil is not commonly used anymore, it may be important when going back and looking at your previous footprints from past years. It's also important to note that the type of oil is determined by how it's refined, and the user will know which type of oil that they use. So the Scope 1 emissions that are currently included in SIMAP only include the combustion phase of the fuel oil life cycle, but there are several upstream phases that are not included in SIMAP yet, and those belong in the Scope 3 category. These stages include all the emissions that occur between the extraction of the crude oil from the ground all the way through the delivery to the delivery of the refined fuel to the oil consumer. So that's Scope 3, and then here on the graph, this is the addition of Scope 3 emissions, which is in green, to the Scope 1 emission factor that's currently in SIMAP, which is in blue. As you can see, the Scope 3 emissions will add a significant contribution to the fuel oil footprint. On average, the scope 3 emission factor for fuel oil is about 3 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per US gallon used by the consumer. And this will add between 25 and 34% to the life cycle emissions of fuel oil. And that range is based on the user's location. So this is because the US is broken up into Petroleum Administration for Defense districts, or PADs. And these 5 regions are used to track the production and consumption of petroleum products within the US. There are significant regional differences in the emission factors of fuel oil because of the types of crude oils that are produced and refined in the specific regions. And you can see that from the graph on the right here. PAD 5 has significantly heavier crude oil, so the extraction process is a little more emission heavy, and the refining process is also produces more emissions on average. So because of these differences, SIMAP will be using the regional factors instead of the national average. And now I'm going to move on to natural gas, which is composed mainly of methane. It's commonly used for cooking, heating, electricity generation, and also in cogeneration plants like the one here at UNH, which is pictured on the right. There are several types of natural gas, and it's important to note that unlike fuel oil, which is defined by how it is refined, the type of natural gas is based on how it was extracted. So in general, the user doesn't know what type of natural gas they're using because by the time it's delivered to them, it's already been processed into a generic natural gas form. So the supply chain for natural gas is broken up similarly to that of fuel oil. It is important to note that for natural gas, there's significantly more pipelines because that's how it is transmitted. Generally, it doesn't use as many tanker trucks as fuel oil. So there's a lot more pipelines, which could lead to more leakage. And the scope 3 emissions for natural gas, once again, is seen here in green, will add about 39% to the life cycle emissions of natural gas. And this is slightly higher than that of fuel oil, but it could even be significantly higher than this pending further research, which I'll get into in a little bit. As of right now, we will be using, we're using a weighted average for the US, and that is 21 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per million BTU. And like I just mentioned, we have further research to do specifically about methane emissions associated with these upstream emissions for natural gas. So far, we found that there's a range of rates between a little bit more than 1% up to about 7%, and that's per unit of natural gas delivered to the consumer. This range heavily depends on the methods and boundaries set in each individual life cycle analysis. So the top-down studies and the bottom-up studies don't really agree. And it also depends on the type of natural gas. So a few studies have shown that shale natural gas emits significantly larger amounts of methane than conventional natural gas because of the extraction method. More methane is emitted in the beginning processes of hydraulic fracturing than for conventional natural gas. And this is really important to point out because natural gas right now makes up about 75% of the US natural gas production. And that production has only been increasing. So more research also needs to be done using the 20-year global warming potentials instead of just the 100-year global warming potentials, because studies have shown that natural gas emissions could be even higher than coal if we look on a 20-year time scale because of the methane content. And speaking of coal, here we have a graph comparing several stationary fuels. And as you can see, coal, the scope 1 emissions for coal are the highest of all of these, followed closely by the fuel oil and liquid propane, or LPG, and then natural gas. And as it's very obvious, the scope 3 emissions for solar are significantly lower than both fuel oil and natural gas. So while it's not a huge contribution, it is still important to look at these upstream emissions for renewable energy, and then also to make sure we take into account the upstream emissions for all of these other fossil fuels and the other renewable energies, so that we can make smarter decisions based on the entire footprint and not just the scope 1 emissions. And with that, I will hand it over to Jen.
Thanks so much, Emily. So that gives you all a little taste or a snapshot of the work on fuel and energy related emissions factors this summer. As Emily just noted, we're going to keep going through this process to include all stationary and then ultimately transport fuels. And I'll say that there's been some exciting work going on this summer in parallel, looking at biomass as well, and the wide range of kind of results based on the approach that you get looking at, including the upstream calculations for that. Relative to the question that was just asked, I'll just say too that we are, electricity generation is something that we will also be working to include as part of this total, this category 3 for fuel and energy related activities. So we'll be looking to add the upstream emissions from electricity generation based on, again, e-grid regions or fuel mixes. That is on the to-do list as well. But the work presented today was purely looking at fuels purchased by the institution for combustion at the institution. So I'm just gonna spend a couple of minutes talking and thinking about what it would mean to incorporate these emissions and the rest of the scope 3 categories for that matter. What does that mean in terms of actually managing the process and setting goals and moving forward toward our carbon commitments? If we're talking about adding multiple new categories, that's a move that is actually beginning to happen outside of higher education. And so we're working pretty hard to help make it happen within higher ed as well. And I want to note that we're not spending the time and the effort and the resources to do this lightly. We believe it's really important and useful potentially for campuses, that it's the right next steps, excuse me. I say that with absolute full awareness, partly because in addition to my work with SIMAP, I am the person on our campus in our office who coordinates our work with our carbon commitment, with STARS, with our energy task force and our climate action planning. So figuring out how to do this is a big part of how I spend my days. And so I'm very aware that every time an emissions factor or calculation methodology changes in SIMAP, it has consequences and it has associated challenges. And so of course, when it comes to shifting boundaries, that's even more true for all of us, always has been, continues to be. Some of those challenges are noted here. We all work really hard to use our data to set goals and develop strategies. So changing the methods and frameworks that we're using seemingly midstream can create concerns about whether it will undermine the perceived credibility of the data and analyses that our offices are providing. And that in turn might make it more difficult for us to bring people along, get buy-in, and maintain momentum for our work to reduce our emissions. And that's especially true when we're suggesting, or when it sounds like we're suggesting, that our institutions should take on additional responsibility for reducing even more emissions. Certainly can be a startling proposition at first when you bring it up for some. So it's also, of course, true that every time we add a category, it's more data to collect or to parse. And I think most of us feel we're already struggling to do too much with too little. And so this can add challenges in that respect. And of course, it also just presents for basic communication challenges when we change how we're talking about our goals. In our office, as you'll see in a minute, we are looking at making significant changes to our goals and how we present them. And so we at this point have spent literally hours thinking and talking and working on graphics that clearly show our new goals in relationship to our old goals. And we're not there yet. So completely acknowledging that that is all real and true and will be part of this process. Why would we change our boundaries, move the goalposts, so to speak? And the answer, of course, is because the global scientific community made it clear in the 2018 special report on climate change, sustainable development, and poverty, often referred to as the 1.5C report, that reality demands it. The image on the left is a slide from the deck that the IPCC prepared as part of that report. And I think that that just says it best for our campuses and for the work that we're doing. Every piece matters. So the emissions coming directly from our power plants and our fleets, Scope 1, and for that matter, Scope 2 emissions, they matter. But if we got them all to zero tomorrow, we'd still have a global climate crisis. And so this notion of complete Scope 3 is really just a way of thinking about how we can expand our positive impact through our procurement choices, our partnerships and initiatives with our local communities, and of course our endowments, because that's a category in complete Scope 3 as well. It can be an opportunity for integration, as Ali talked about at the beginning, with other initiatives, some of our STARS data collection and work, so that instead of it feeling like multiple initiatives, we can capitalize on the momentum and the resources that we already are putting into this climate work, and bring these kind of sometimes parallel efforts together. And of course, when we first started doing this and we weren't including complete Scope 3, part of the reason for that is because we literally did not have the tools to do it. The data wasn't there, the data systems weren't there, and now more and more of those tools are available. But continuing to develop those tools for complete Scope 3, the emissions factors, the data analytics, it demands so much research and engaged scholarship. And of course, that's an opportunity to tie to the educational endeavors of our faculty and our students. So that's, of course, easy to say and hard to do. I apologize, I missed all these. I missed all these animations. So we've been wrestling with this question of, yeah, great, sounds good, but how would we do it here at UNH for the past 18 months as we've tackled updating our climate action plan? And so just a little bit of background. Our first climate action plan was published in 2009, and we originally did it, we combined all of our report, we reported what we had committed to reporting under the climate commitment, then the ACU-PCC, and we set goals for all of those categories combined. We said we want to get to 80% reductions across the board by 2050, 50% by 2020. And because we had already done a number of greenhouse gas inventories and had good data going back to 2001 and had done some kind of internal thinking about 2001 as a baseline, we used that again as a baseline year for everything. But when we set those goals and had signed on to the commitment, we didn't actually have the data for air travel, for business travel. We didn't start beginning to collect that until 2010 or so. And so then we had to backcast that data, basically. We didn't have the data. We put in a placeholder back to our 2001 baseline in order to be able to track progress. And we are still working to try to get complete data in those categories. in 2014, we updated our climate action plan. We kept the same goals and boundaries. But since then, we've started measuring emissions from food as part of our work with both carbon and nitrogen. And because sustainable dining is a huge focus on our campus anyway, we've also started talking about the big picture in terms of capital goods, our campus energy system, and energy investments, because our current system, which relies on a landfill gas pipeline, we know we're going to need something different probably by the end of this decade, that has a limited shelf life. So we're having some meaty conversations about, could natural gas be a bridge if we need it? Is that our next investment? Or biomass, is that our next investment? And so having this data is critical to really have informed conversations. And I guess I should say having this range of data in this case is critical to having informed conversations about that. And so for our new climate action plan, we've tentatively decided that we're going to take a new approach as outlined below. We are going to report our scope 1 and 2 combined annually and we have a reduction goal to be net zero by 2030, ideally, for scope 1 and 2. But we're going to report our scope 3 emissions category by category. We will add categories over time if and as we are able to, and we will set separate goals for that. We do want to continue to honor our carbon neutrality commitment, but separating it out this way allows us to talk about our direct versus indirect impacts in a way that makes sense to our campus community, and it meets and kind of checks a number, meets a number of goals for us. So this has been a really slow process and set of conversations, but worthwhile. And so the keys for us in doing this so far, and not that we are there by any means, we're not, but what has worked when it has worked so far has been to acknowledge the challenges every step of the way, acknowledge the concerns, but also to continually refocus on the benefits. So for example, including the emissions from solar or wind at first seemed really crazy to some folks, until, especially for our energy manager, until they realized, well, this is one way to really focus on the benefits of efficiency, which have definitely, in spite of many good efforts, kind of taken backseat for us, because it seemed we could go further, faster with fuel switching. And so the message that there's no—
Curious to hear more about how other campuses are tackling this. So in summary here, we've presented our update on complete scope 3 in SIMAP. As we acknowledge, it is challenging to report on these additional scope 3 categories from a collection process, from a communication perspective, a calculation perspective, but we think there are many reasons to add full scope 3 accounting into our footprints. It provides informed decision-making, so you can't manage what you don't measure. It helps provide quantitative data for a number of other related initiatives like STARS and the Real Food Challenge and student research. And it also provides a leadership opportunity. So this is this new and emerging category. And there's a need for campuses to take a leadership role in helping to develop methods and applying these new categories. And finally, it also provides, having this full scope 3 provides a great research opportunity for students. So we, as you all heard from Tigran and Emily earlier in this presentation, adding in these categories was a great opportunity to have a clearly defined and important and impactful student research project. And as far as the FERA research in particular, fuel and energy related activities, our next steps are to finalize the emission factors that you heard about today for fuel oil, natural gas, and solar, and to also complete calculations for additional energy categories for the upstream emissions. So we're looking at biofuels, wind, coal, and more. We're also going to be finalizing the methods for purchased electricity, so the upstream emissions associated with your purchased electricity, and then we'll be incorporating this into SIMAP. So we don't yet have a date for when we plan to release this, but we plan to release it as a package so that you've got all of the upstream energy emission factors. So stay tuned for more on that. So at this point, we're ready to move over to questions. And Jen, are you